Lord, let there be peace among the children. Let there be peace. Let there be...
Welcome to Reflections. Your speaker is the Reverend Eron Henry of Alexandria, Virginia, in the United States.
John 15 states, I have called you friends, for everything that I have learned from my Father I have made known to you. This friendship is based on a change of status. I no longer call you servants because a servant does not know his master's business. Relationships in ancient Israel were based on either a slave-master relationship or client-patron relationship. There were marked differences in power, privilege, and honor. It is said that societies such as Israel's in Jesus' day had 9 classes of people, 5 privileged classes and 4 at the bottom. The privileged classes include the ruler, next was the governing class, which averaged out to about 1% of the population, but benefited from about 1/4 of the national income. Together with the ruler, the governing class would control half of the country's resources. Then there was the retainer class that averaged 5% of the population and ranged from scribes and bureaucrats to soldiers and generals, and was united in service to the political class. There was the merchant class that consisted of persons who moved from the lower classes. Many grew wealthy and some were able to attain a measure of political power. And then there were the priestly class, the last but not the least among the privileged groups. At the bottom was the peasant class, the vast majority of the population. They had the burden of supporting the state and the privileged classes, especially the peasant farmers who were the majority of the population. Their energies were put to full use by the privileged groups who also deprived the peasants of the basic necessities of life. Next we find the artisan class, skilled workmen who, it is said, were recruited from the ranks of the dispossessed peasantry. They made up about 5% of the population. Even though the peasant and artisan classes shared similar status, the artisans had less wealth than the peasants. Below the peasants and artisans were the unclean and degraded classes. These included miners, prostitutes, leather workers, etc. Finally, there were the expendable class, averaging between 5 and 10% of the population. These included a variety of types such as petty criminals, outlaws, beggars, and unemployed itinerant workers. At the lower end also were slaves, the majority of whom would be at the very bottom, though a few would carry a higher rank based on the level and the type of service they provided. The slaves related to their masters, and the level and type of their service determined if they were expendable or not. Those who were not slaves and were at the lower end of society had to have a patron if they were to make progress in life, or if they were to receive the basic necessities they need. A patron would provide support to the person at the lower level, who in turn was obligated to him in some way. The one thing that undergirds both the slave master and the client-patron relationship is inequality. The client was never equal to the patron, and the slave was never equal to the master. That is how it was. The only way equality could take place was for the client to cease being a client and acquire the same status as his patron, and for the slave to become free and in turn acquire the same status as his master. This rarely happened. It was extremely difficult to change one's status to acquire that of the master or patron. One of the revolutionary acts of Jesus was to overturn this aspect of relating to one another. Jesus had all types of people in his group. He had those from the upper classes, some from Herod's household were his followers, and persons such as Joseph of Arimathea were among his disciples. These were people from the privileged classes. The majority of those who followed Jesus were from the lower classes, however, and some were even from the dependable classes. When Jesus referred to them as friend, Jesus was at one and the same time telling them that they shared equal status with one another despite their backgrounds and their own status in society, and that he shared equal status with them. There was or ought to be no inequality between them. No one in Jesus' mind was privileged and another set not privileged. No one was elite and another set expendable. To be friends meant that their status had changed. They were equal, they were one. This equality and oneness would be important when fierce opposition arose and when death threatened. As they saw each other as equal, they would be prepared to do what a friend would do. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Even in the face of death, as friends, they, despite their various backgrounds, would stand their ground and support each other. Secondly, this friendship is grounded in intimacy. Intimacy is described as a close or warm friendship or a feeling of belonging together. But the intimacy of this friendship referred to by Jesus goes deeper. In Rome and certain Eastern societies, there were the court officials who essentially carried out the wishes of the emperor or king. These were men who held high offices, but there was another group, one consisting of persons who did not necessarily hold positions of power in the empire or kingdom. This group of persons exercised great influence. They were referred to as, quote, the friends of the king or, quote, the friends of the emperor. They had access to the king or emperor at all times. They, more than anyone else, had the right to go to the king's private quarters, even at first thing in the morning, something that most officials could not do. The king would often talk with these men before he spoke with the generals, the rulers, and the statesmen in the kingdom. When Jesus called the disciples friends, he was not only changing their status, he was calling them into the intimacy of sharing in his rule as king. It is an intimacy that no one else has. It is an intimacy that invites the disciples into knowledge of the deep mysteries of God, into an understanding of the finer details of God's mission and work through Christ. It is to know the mind and the heart of God in the same way that the friends of the king would have an understanding of the mind and heart of the king that officials and the statesmen in the kingdom did not have. All this had serious implications. If the disciples shared an intimacy with God that would lead them into knowledge of God's mysteries, then no opposition or persecution should deter them from supporting each other and from standing up for the faith. Knowing the mind and the heart of God would give them a sense of belonging together that no one or nothing would be able to separate them from each other or separate them from God.
That was Reverend Eron Henry. Reverend Henry worked for a global Christian nonprofit for more than 12 years and traveled to 30 countries. He is an expert in global Christian mission and international religious affairs. He is the author of Reverend Mother, a novel available on Amazon.com. You may follow Reverend Henry on Facebook or on Twitter. You may book Reverend Henry for speaking engagements by writing to eronhenry@yahoo.com. That is EronHenry@yahoo.com. Among the topics he covers are congregational renewal and how to engage in effective Christian mission. I am Joyful, and be sure to listen to the next installment of our podcast, Reflections.
Lord, let there be peace among the children.